I'm really looking forward to this panel. Good afternoon. I'm Susan Williamson, Festival Director. Welcome to what is the final event of the 17th Annual Palm Beach Poetry Festival, the Beloved Poems Panel, featuring Tim Seibles, Martha Rhodes, Kevin Prufer, Vievee Francis, Eduardo C. Corral, Traci Brimhall, Laure-Anne Bosselaar, and David Baker, each discussing one poem that has been beloved in their life and influenced them in their writing. Our own Nickole Brown will facilitate this panel. The panel will be followed by a Q&A session with the audience, and the handout to this panel was made available to you in the chat, and for some of you by other means. Don't forget, when it comes time for the Q&A and chat, the Q&A, place your questions in the Q&A link, and you can use the chat function. Before Nickole begins, I'd like to thank our sponsors and supporters: Morgan Stanley, the Legacy Group of Atlanta, Gladstone Multimedia, the Cultural Council of Palm Beach County, Visit Florida, Murder on the Beach Bookstore, the National Endowment for the Arts, and all our other sponsors and supporters for their support. I'd especially like to thank our founder and president, Miles Kuhn, and his wife, Mimi. It's coming up on Miles' birthday, and we just want to say happy, happy birthday. This is a throwback to a cake that we had in person for Miles some years ago with one of his beloved poems. He wishes for the claws of heaven. Thank you, Miles, for everything you've done to found the festival and keep it going for all of these years. I hope you have a really great birthday. This is a present. Now, please welcome our moderator, Nickole Brown.
Hello all, greetings from Asheville, North Carolina. Because this is the last time that we'll gather together this year, let me just say how grateful I am. When it comes to 2020, I felt kind of like the Who in Whoville with COVID playing the part of the Grinch that stole poetry. And I'll be damned if we aren't all gathered around the tree in the center of town singing, despite the fact of the pandemic and how it stole our chance to be in Delray in person together this year. So to begin, I'd like to thank the Jetson-style technologies and the tech wizards and determined Luddites, I might say, that even made this possible. And of course, that includes Susan and Jen and Marcy and Ira and the many hardworking millennial interns. Thank God for you. And I'd also like to lend my heartfelt appreciation for this year's more than willing faculty and participants, some of whom scraped their asses out of bed at ungodly hours on the West Coast to make this happen. You know who you are, and thank you. This year is the 17th, and it marks a dream made by, of course, birthday boy Miles Kuhn and his fabulous wife, Mimi. And it was a dream that they had with Tom Lux and Kurt Brown. And I can't believe my insanely good luck to count this as the 13th time I've been nourished by this festival. That said, speaking of nourishing, what you're about to experience is hands down my favorite at the festival every year. And that is the beloved poems panel, a time in which each of the writers we've been learning from all week will go even deeper to share a favorite poem of theirs. I often consider this panel a time to peer into a poet's lineage, to get a taste of the DNA coursing through their hearts and imaginations, to see just how the poems that carry one will, in turn, carry another. As Laure-Anne Bosselaar always reminds me, what we have here is a chorus. Because when poets share their own words, what rises up is a cumulative kind of song. And this event is like hearing that chorus, but doubled. It gives us a chance to delight in the notes underneath the song we've already grown to love. So today we'll be going in reverse alphabetical order of all this year's faculty, not one of which needs any kind of introduction at all. I'm thrilled to hear the poems each will share and hope you'll help me welcome the first in line, Tim Seibles. Oh, Tim, you're muted.
I got it. Thank you. I don't know whether any of you heard music while Nickole was introducing the evening. No, okay. Something happened and my computer started playing a song and I thought, what's going on? I feel much better if no one heard it. Anyway, such a pleasure to be here. I love to hear what poems people love and, you know, what makes people, I don't know, what makes our poetic hearts tick and so on. Pablo Neruda, though I know his work truthfully in translation primarily, I've always, or since I've discovered his work, I've loved his poems for a number of reasons, one of which is the range of what he does and the fact that he can go from intensely surreal poetry to love poems to intensely political poems. And sometimes those things actually merge. Anyway, so this poem is called I'll Explain Some Things. I've also heard it translated, I explain some things. So it's hard to figure. That's the thing about not being fluent in a language. You have to trust the translators. And I know enough Spanish from just trying to read words and learning vocabulary that sometimes I know that translators take liberties, which I guess is their right. But what I have been moved by over the years is the spirit of Pablo Neruda's work. Really, I couldn't claim to really have a sense of Spanish in my bones. I can't claim that, but what I sense in his work speaks to me. And this is true of many of the poets who wrote in Spanish, Cesar Vallejo, for example, Federico Garcia Lorca also. I love them. I know them really in translation more than anything else.
Tim, you muted yourself again.
Okay, sorry. Wait, all right.
Space bar.
I have a slightly, you can hear me now? I have a slightly different translation in front of me, I think, than the people have been given. So I hope this is all right. I explain some things. I explain a few things. You are going to ask, where are the lilacs and the poppy-petaled metaphysics and the rain repeatedly spattering its words and drilling them full of apertures and birds? I'll tell you all the news. I lived in a suburb of Madrid with bells and clocks and trees. From there, you could look out over Castile's dry face, a leather ocean. My house was called the House of Flowers because in every cranny, geraniums exploded. It was a good-looking house with dogs and children. Remember Raul? Remember Rafael? Federico, do you remember? From under the ground where the light of June flowered in your mouth. Brother, my brother, everything loud with big voices, the salt of merchandises, pile-ups of palpitating bread, the stalls of my suburb of Arguez, with its statue like a drained inkwell in a swirl of hake. Oil flowed into spoons, a deep baying of feet and hands swelled in the streets. Meters, liters, the sharp measure of life. Stacked up fish, the texture of roofs with a cold sun in which the weather vane falters. The fine, frenzied ivory of potatoes, wave on wave of tomatoes rolling down to the sea. And one morning, all that was burning. One morning, the bonfires leapt out of earth, devouring human beings. And from then on, fire, gunpowder from then on. And from then on, blood, bandits with planes and Moors, bandits with finger rings and duchesses, bandits with black friars spattering blessings came through the sky to kill children. And the blood of children ran through the streets without fuss, like children's blood. Jackals that the jackals would despise. Stones that the dry thistle would bite on and spit out. Vipers that the vipers would abominate. Face to face with you, I have seen the blood of Spain tower like a tide to drown you in one wave of pride and knives. Treacherous generals, look at my dead home. Look at broken Spain. But from each dead house, burning metal shoots out instead of flowers. From every shell hole in Spain, Spain will rise. From every dead child, a rifle with eyes will rise. From every crime, bullets will be born, which will one day find a place in your hearts. You ask, why doesn't your poetry speak to us of dreams and leaves, of the great volcanoes of your native land? Come, see the blood along the streets. Come, see the blood in the streets. Come and see the blood in the streets. Anyway, I realized that the translation I have is different from the one I must have sent. And I like parts of both of them, but I'll just talk about the poem. And you can find, fortunately or unfortunately, you can find many versions of this poem translation. Some of the differences in this text and the one on screen are really pretty surprising in their difference. Anyway, the thing I love about this poem, particularly in this moment, is just that, I mean, always, I think this is always the case, we are often surrounded by beauty, things that we love, memories that are pleasant, and so on. But at the same time, we're confronted with the fact of what happens in the world politically, the horrors of the world. In the past year, of course, what comes to mind are the numerous deaths, George Floyd's in particular, but the other deaths that are connected to George Floyd's death that are rooted in the same kind of, in my mind, racist violence. And I think many times, of course, and perhaps some of my fellow panelists have experienced this as well, people will ask, I wish poetry were happier, or, they'll say, why isn't poetry happier? Why isn't there, and I love poems that are lighter and sweeter, but, I'm always shocked that people are so surprised that poetry might be sad or be full of political complaint given the world we live in. And one of the things I love about Neruda is that he just goes right at this. He just says, you are going to ask this, and why not this and that? I'll tell you. And basically all the news, what's really going on. And so when I think about the violence that he's addressing, mean, he's talking about the Spanish Civil War, of course. We're not exactly in a civil war. We are, I don't know, teetering on something really frightening, it seems to me. The atmosphere to me is similar. I mean, there's horror in the streets of America, much of which we don't have to see. This is a big country, and much of what happens never reaches television, CNN, MSNBC, certainly not Fox. And I do think in various ways, our obligation as artists and as people who are trying to think and remain engaged in social issues and in the society that we live in, to be engaged, not just here for entertainment, but to be engaged by the way things go here. We have to talk about the blood in the streets. The ending of that poem to me is the critical thing. Come see the blood in the streets. It's interesting, the translation that's on screen says, come see the blood along the streets, which I thought was very strange. The translation I'm looking at now says, come see the blood in the streets. Come see the blood in the streets. To me, that's sharper, feels truer to the moment we're in. Along almost has the blood kind of next to the street or something, but in the streets feels like the true way of things. The other thing I love about this poem, and as I said, I'm not a Spanish speaker, but I love to go back and forth between and looking at the translations and the words. There's, in this translation at least, there's a discussion of the fine frenzied ivory of potatoes. And in Spanish, it looks like delirante marfil fino de las patatas, which is a whole nother universe of sound, you know? And then wave on wave of tomatoes rolling down to the sea, tomates repetidos hasta el mar. So different, right? Just the idea of bouncing between those two musics. I don't know, there's something very magical to me about that, that the same thing is said, the heart is the same. It doesn't really matter the language, right? That you have a sense that if Neruda were an American, had he been born and raised, and if he sat among us right now, for example, his poetry would still be what it was, even if he's writing in English. He might have a whole different symphony accompanying it, but the idea of it, the sensitivity that he brings to his work would still be the same. And in that way, I think, poets all across the globe are family. And I find that in Pablo Neruda's work, and I find my own anxieties and some of the things that charm me about life chronicled in this poem. The idea of a good-looking house with its dogs and children. Anyway, but those are the things I think about.
Tim, let me ask you really quickly, who wrote the translation that you read from? The audience is dying to know.
Okay, let me see. This was translated by,
Jody Bateman wrote the one in your handout, but we were wondering who.
I see, this one just says, it's funny, it just says translated by Poetry International. So I don't have a name, but I will go back to the website. Maybe it'll say more somewhere else there. But I will find out. But you can.
You read better. Yeah, it was really interesting.
I like this one too. I love lines like the poppy pedaled metaphysics. I really love that. That says it all, right? About the kind of nonsense people might expect of poetry exclusively. But yeah, I'll find out who the translator, or someone, you can go to the website, I think Poetry International, and you'll find what I'll find.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, it was a pleasure.
Next up, we have Martha Rhodes.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and what a great week it's been. Thank you all. I'm going to ask you guys a favor, which is not to read the poem. You may know it, but don't read it yet, because I'd like to go through it cold, as if you're just coming to it for the first time. Oh no, but I do need the screen share. Thank you, though. Don't take it away from me. Thank you. So just kind of stare somewhere else, or read along with me. That's what I want to say. Don't go vertical until I go vertical there. Okay. So it's funny to think of this as a beloved poem. It's a very painful poem. And when I think of beloved poems, I think of poems that aren't quite so difficult and heightened to read, but it is a poem I love, and it is a poem that I admire, and a poem that I continue to learn from. I'm interested in working with multiple voices in poetry, and I'm interested in heightened material, material that is amplified. And as you know from my talk, I'm interested in temperature, in heat, in cold, in neutral, and how shifts happen within a poem. We begin the poem with the title, Jasper, Texas, 1998, for J. Bird. J. Bird isn't part of the title. In some versions, you see that below. In some versions like this, it's on the same line. Jasper, Texas, 1998. There's no comma between Jasper. There's no, in Cliftonian style, there's no capital J or capital T. It's Jasper, Texas, 1998. We know from the beginning that this poem is located or in Texas, in Jasper, and it's a year. There's not a date. It doesn't say the date. It says the year, which gives us a sense of time, of the time of a year, 12 months. We move then to the first line. I am a man's head hunched in the road. I am a man's head hunched in the road. It's a visual. We see it, and we see again location, in the road, not on the road, not under the road, not beside the road, but in the road. And visually, that's very, very specific, because for this reader, I see a man's head in the road. I don't see it three-dimensional. I see it flattened in the road, in the road. That's really important to me. And then I go back to the dedication for J. Bird. The name is James Bird, but it's been cut off here. It's J period, J period, not James, but J period. It's been abbreviated. The AMES has been cut off. It's J period. That's all that's left. I am a man's head hunched in the road. I assumed for a long time, until very, very, very recently, from the very first line, that the I is a spokesperson for J. Bird. I'm on the cusp now about that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Spokesperson, the head of J. Bird, or another speaker is the head, the spokes, who's behind that voice. I was chosen to speak by the members, line break, the members. Members of what? Members of community? No, members of my body. Members of my body, period, caesura, break. We start again. The arm, as it pulled away, pointed toward me. The hand opened once and was gone. This brings us to history. If we don't know what Jasper, Texas is 1998, and we look it up, this is the history of James Bird, who was dragged to his death and dismembered, his right arm detached, as did his head. So this is the head that's speaking. It's not the man's head, it's a man's head. It's not that man's head, it's a man's head. A man's head. Why and why and why should I, why to I sonically, why and why and why should I call a white man brother? Why, I, white, those sounds, man, brother. question mark. Mind in action. I've been talking about that this week with my workshop. The head is thinking why or questioning why. And the emphasis on the why, it's not just why should I, it's why and why and why. This is heating up. This is heating up. Well, it's already hot from the beginning, it's getting boiling. Who is the human in this place? The thing that is dragged or the dragger? The head that's no longer attached to the body, is that a human still? Or the one who dragged, is that a human? What does my daughter say? What does my daughter say to that question? And that's the place in the poem where just recently, for some reason, I was thinking about the daughter, and I was thinking, why not children, son? And Bird had one son. And Clifton had 4 kids, 4 daughters, 2 sons. So I don't have an answer for why daughter in this poem, but that just was interesting to me, that it's a man, it's not the man's head or that man's head, that this head is standing in for many. For many is something that I've been thinking about over the last few weeks. After many years of reading this as being the spokesperson for Jay Bird, I've shifted and thinking that it's going back to a man's, that's really important. There is a sort of specificity in but it's not the same specificity of if it was definitely referring to Jay Bird, and it's for Jay Bird. What does my daughter say? The sun is a blister overhead. Again, talking about temperature, we're getting hot, hot. Blister is hot, and it's overhead. It's coming down. If you were to see this, you've got the road and the head in the road, and the sun is overhead. I'd like to look back at also the word members, member and head. Member and head. There's subliminally that can call up the genitalia and head as well. And if one thinks about what happened to this body, there's and also the title, which is getting rid of the aims in James. There is a stripping away of selfhood, of manhood, of head, of arm, of everything. So that's just in the background, the word members and head. If I were alive, those eyes again, those insistent eyes, if I were alive, I could not bear it. Think about the heat that's coming. If I were alive, I could not bear it. So there's somewhat of detachment there, because in a way it's saying I'm not alive anymore. And so therefore I'm detached from it now. The townsfolk sing, we shall overcome. Again, we've got that over and over. While hope bleeds slowly from my mouth, the poem brings us right back to where we started at that point, which is a man's head hunched in the road, hunched. Also, I sorry, but I didn't mention the word hunched, which brings up into also shoulders that can be hunched. And when we have a hunch about something, we have we have some sort of intuition about something, we have a question about something. I am like, why? And that will link into hunched, will link into a questioning, why and why and why. So hope bleeds slowly from my mouth, which brings us back to the time of death, and hope being of something that one speaks of what sings of. We shall overcome. While hope bleeds, not sings, not speaks, it bleeds slowly from my mouth into the dirt. We're back in the road, into the dirt that covers, remember, over a few lines up and over a few lines above that, covers us all, over to become covers us all. We're now all implicated in this. We're all implicated in this. I am done with the dust. I am done. Direct expression here. It's all been direct expression. And this is the final expression. I am done. I am no longer alive. I am done. I'm not singing We Shall Overcome. They're singing it, not me. I'm done. I'm done with them. I'm done with the white man why should I call him brother? I am done. Finished. I am done with this dust, period. I am done, period. So this is a pretty spare poem, but the accumulation of these key words, head, hunched, in, members, body, arm, pulled away, the literal, what happened at that time, and also the disassociation, the arm pulling away, pointing toward me. There's a sense of implication there. The hand opened once and was gone. So there's a sense of really an enactment of the event as the parts of the body leave. And what are we left with is this head hunched. Why and why and why? So that's a short 5 to 6 minute discussion of this very complex poem that's dealing with incredibly heightened material. It is directly expressed, and yet it is extremely restrained. And I think that restraint comes at the very beginning with the parts of the body that are being pulled away. There's this sense of detachment and of this overhead. So a sense of, again, here's the road and above it, sort of like an astral projection of the arm going away and the hand opening and is gone. We're left with the head and the detached head. And now I'm done and I am done. So I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Wow, Martha, I mean, it's an excruciating poem, and I love Laure-Anne Bosselaar wrote in the chat, a brilliant, super boiling close Martha reading to you. Like, that's just such a brilliantly close reading. Next up, we have Kevin Prufer.
Hi. I think I'm going to follow Martha's example of speaking first, and then maybe I'll read the poem after I say something. But I'm not going to offer a super close-up, boiling hot reading like Martha just did. I want to talk a little bit about who this guy is and what I've learned from him, and then maybe this poem. In class this week, we've been spending a lot of time talking about this sort of Levertovian idea that the experience of many of the conventions of free verse poetry is something like the experience of listening in on a complex mind at work on an unsolvable problem, and that the way the poem is scored on the page can suggest those moments of unarticulated thought before they burst into articulation. So the silence of the stanza break suggests a mind thinking, but not thinking in words before the words come. And I've loved this way of thinking about free verse poetry, partly because I think it opens up so many possibilities for thinking about how our words might interact with paper. But partly because it suggests to me that reading poetry and writing poetry is participating in an act of empathy, that it's asking you to enter the mind of someone else and live there for a change. So one day, about 6 years ago, I was in Cleveland, which is my hometown, and my friend Michael gave me this book right there. I don't know if you can see it. I'm probably a postage stamp. It doesn't matter. It's a tattered book published in 1976, and it was the only book Russell Atkins ever wrote. And I was walking down Euclid Avenue in Cleveland, and I read this poem, Lakefront Cleveland, and it just blew my mind, partly because what it was doing was not what I'd always told myself poems do. I didn't seem to be trapped in a mind at all. And the more I read in this book, the book is called Here in the, but you'll never find it because there's not a single copy available anywhere on the market. And mine is held together with binder clips and is stained and ragged, but his selected poems just did come out. So you can get them, but you can't get Here in the. But when I got to Here in the, when I read this, it was as though I wasn't being asked to inhabit a mind other than my own at all. It was as though I was asked to inhabit maybe the mind of Lake Erie, if Lake Erie could have thoughts, or a building. And I needed to learn who this Russell Atkins guy was. And it turned out he was a Clevelander like me. He was an African-American experimental poet who considered himself an avant-garde poet, who wrote most of his great work in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, but he's still alive. He's 96, and he's in a nursing home in Cleveland. We talk on the phone a lot, and he's still writing poems, and they're still kind of brilliant. He was trained, he's a guy, we were talking about him in my class today, he's a guy who never really finished things. You know those kinds of super brilliant people who just start a lot of things? And he started to be a music theorist, and then he didn't finish. He didn't finish the degree, and then he became a composer, and he composed symphonies. That was performed by the Cleveland Orchestra, but he never published them. And he wrote these brilliant poems, but he only wrote this one book. Everything else he self-published in little pamphlets. He never left Cleveland. He just stayed there. When I finally got to meet him, it took a lot of detective work. I found him in a retirement home. He was a ward of the state. I believe his home had been bulldozed because of that eminent domain decision of the Supreme Courts to make way for a super target. But he was there up in this nursing home, and I went and visited, and we talked for a long time, and I kept on coming back, you know. I was learning about his ideas about poetry and about his great manifesto, which says everything that I don't teach in it. It says a poem should not find as its source communication, it should find as its source coming into existence. And it was the coming into existence that was important for him, not that it was performing on the page for somebody else. Anyway, I wanted to tell you about him because I think he's so important, and he's writing against the grain of a lot of what I imagine was happening in poetry in the 60s and 70s, particularly in African-American poetry, which he was very aware of. He was very aware of the fact that he was doing something quite different from what a lot of his peers were doing. And I think that maybe a little bit combined with the fact that he didn't leave Cleveland, combined with the fact that he didn't really publish books, so much as sort of self-published pamphlets, all of this has helped to keep him out of our vision. And I just wish he were in our vision. So that's my talk about Russell Atkins. And I'm just going to read this poem. I think it is beautiful. And I hope, you know, it helped me think about my own work in a new way. The way encountering a brilliant person who does everything the opposite of you could help you put your work in perspective and help you say like, you know, wow, there are possibilities here that I didn't realize for language. So I'm going to read this poem by Russell Atkins, Lakefront, Cleveland. I get nervous reading his poems. Lakefront, Cleveland. So thunders sea. It gathers strength, summoned, ascends, huged up, then softs, curls up about rocks, up curls about thick, about bold, curls up about it, then dangerous, soft. Sea gathers strength, summoned, ascends, up huged over whatever's around, crashes, curls up about rock, up curls about, at boldly, abruptly, curls about it, softs, dangerous, so oft, too soft almost, summoned, ascends, up huged, crashes, curls up about rock, softs, furious but soft, too soft, whist, almost, Whom whamming everywhere it gathers strength, summoned, ascends, huged up, splash about of bold, up curls about rock, rocks about impetuous curls, curls up about softs, dangerously, too soft with a shudder. Thank you.
Oh, that was incredible, and I loved hearing that story about meeting him. It's so cool. Next up is Vievee Francis.
Lucille Clifton, won't you celebrate with me? Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model, born in Babylon, both non-white and woman. What did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay. My one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. I'm actually going to read that twice. I stumbled in the middle, and I hate stumbling in this poem that means so much to me. Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model, born in Babylon, both non-white and woman. What did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. I'll begin my discussion on my brief discussion on this particular poem by stating that for over a year, there was nothing on my office door in my department but this poem. So why would I put that on my door? No one asked me why it was there. Everyone knew why it was there. This poem means something to me, and so much to me, because I find as I get older, myself being less and less able to separate the poems I'm reading from myself and my own life. I would say that I've been in several environments where I'm asked to do that, and I simply refuse to anymore. I find myself thinking about Lucille often because in this latter part of my life, it's who I'm most compared to. Although Lucille was not my largest influence, Szymborska was a greater influence on my work than Lucille. And I don't believe in lineage being claimed by race alone. I find it racist to believe that that is how we think of lineage in terms of race or in terms of gender. We can really narrow that. If I only read 57-year-old Black women, that's a problem. Though I probably know many white males at 65 who only read other 65-year-old white males and hear only the music of themselves. I do not hear only the music of myself, but do I recognize the music in this as it relates to me? I most certainly do. Do I recognize the longing and the call and the sharp irony? Won't you celebrate with me? No one will celebrate with me. And I'm thinking about the field itself. Some of us have fought and clawed our way into this field, being told that we did not have the music of others. Thank you for reading that particular piece, Kevin. I appreciate that. Because that is my fear. My fear is not having my work read. My fear is not having it read on my own terms. every fear I have is here in this poem. For me, this is an ars poetica. Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I like to add what I've shaped into a kind of poet's life, which I find to be like any other poet's life, but which I'm constantly told is unlike a poet's life. My vernacular, my visage. When did poetry become so visual? It doesn't matter what I look like. Born in Babylon, both non-white and woman. I'm not going to explicate Babylon. For me, this resonates as born into something that does not wish to have me. So what did I see to be except myself? I'm self-taught. That resonates with me. I saw myself, and then I had to go out and seek myself to have myself affirmed. Why do I have to do that? Why should I have to do that? I should have affirmation as a poet. And I'm thinking about this too because of all of Lucille Clifton's poems, this one seems to me, although I never had the opportunity to meet her, and so many of my friends did, to come closest to the heart of the matter, holding her own hand, surviving. And do I believe that something tried to kill not this speaker, but Lucille herself, because the skein between speaker and Lucille is very thin here? I absolutely do. For every comment about Lucille I hear that is beautiful and laudable, I hear a comment that disgusts me. I hear her otherization in ways I can barely tolerate. Thank you, Martha, for reading that close read of her work. I'm going to remember that. That was resonant and beautiful. That's the way I want to hear her work spoken of. So my fear is that even after I'm dead, something will try to kill me or destroy the work. So this means something to me as a poet. And I'm not going in this particular reading like I've done all week. I'm not going to separate my own life from the life of the poet, from the life of the speaker. It resonates with me because it exists as a whole. And inside of the academy, I believe that writers like me are constantly asked to do that. And I'm going to refer to Kundera again. If I do that, I'm risking something that I don't want to risk. And then I say, why should I do that? Who determined those rules? And those rules aren't made for me. They're made in opposition to me. So I'll end my note by saying something has tried to kill me and has failed and will continue to fail. And if something is trying to kill you, may it fail. That's what I think we can all take from Lucille Clifton. Thank you.
Ooh, Ivy, that was really good reading. I'll repeat what Tim said in the chat. He said, "Amen, amen." And Julia wrote in to say that that was so honest and brave. That this poem is close to my heart too, and it's just I love how much it has to give. Eduardo C. Corral is up next.
Thank you all. Thank you, Vievee, for that. I'm going to read a poem by Karin De Weille, a contemporary Canadian poet who's one of my favorite poets who's writing in English that I'm aware of, right? I don't like when people say, this is my favorite poet in the world, as if we have read every poet in the world, but she's one of my favorite English language poets that I am aware of. When I read a poem, I try to pluck three pleasures out of the text. Out of the stanzas, out of the lines, right? The three pleasures are linguistic pleasure, right? The music, the syntax, right? The diction itself, right? All those cadences, those sonic patterns. And an intellectual pleasure can be, form, argument, diction itself, again, allusion, references. Emotional pleasure can be contact with the interiority of another, right? Other memories, epiphanies, experiences, and histories, right? Of course, these pleasures often overlap. An intellectual pleasure can be an emotional pleasure. An emotional pleasure can be a linguistic pleasure, right? So I loved to see how the poet has actually braided these three pleasures, right? This began for me as a reading strategy. But over the years, it transformed into a compositional and revision strategy. I know one of my poems is near completion when I find all of the three pleasures in my work, right? Sometimes I have to elevate one pleasure over the other, maybe the linguistic or the emotional intellectual in this certain draft, right? But a telltale sign for me this poem is almost there is when these three pleasures are braided in an interesting, surprising way for me. I'm going to read Karin Solee's Sturgeon. Then I'm going to talk briefly about two pleasures, the linguistic pleasures in the poem and some of the intellectual pleasures in the poem. And if you're interested in Karin Solee, I would encourage you to get The Living Option, was her new and selected out of the UK, which you can really find easily stateside. But she's been published, her last two books have been published stateside with FSG. You can find them. But I often think it's really important to begin with the poet's beginning and then follow up to the newer work. Sturgeon. Jackfish and walleye circle like clouds as he strains the silt floor of his pool. A lost lure in his lip. 5 of diamonds, river, runt, lazy Ike. Or a simple spoon, feeding a slow disease of rust through his body's quiet armor. Kin to caviar. He's an oily mudfish, an edible, indelible, ancient grunt of sea, in a warm prairie river. Prehistory, a third eye in his head. He rests, and time passes as water and sand through the long throat of him and hiss as thoughts of food. We take our guilts to his valley and dump them in, give him quicksilver to corrode his fins, weed killer, gas oil mix, wrap him in poisoned arms. Our bottom feeder, sin eater. On an afternoon mean as a hook, we hauled him up to his nightmare of us and laughed at his ugliness, soft sucker mouth opening, closing, on air that must have felt like ground glass, left him to die with disdain for what we could not consume. And when he began to heave and thrash over yards of rock to the water's edge, and unbelievably in, we couldn't hold him, though we were teenaged and bigger than everything, could not contain the old current he had for a mind, its pull, and his body a muscle called river, called spawn. Some of the linguistic pleasures that I kind of find in this poem is just the pleasures of new diction for me. The types of fish, jackfish, walleye, isn't just wonderful words on the tongue, right? River runt, lazy Ike, which are types of lures, right? More beautiful music in the mouth. And also find the pleasures of sonic patterns, right? In this example, Solee, often like in most of her poem, she's very fond of the Anglo-Saxon technique of alliterative pairs and triplets. For example, in that poem, simple spoon, could not contain, lost lure, soft sucker, ground glass, river runt, right? What a beautiful way to structure music in a poem, right? One of the things I often talk to myself and to my students is, we have to encounter poets who fill us with envy. Like, I am so furious that you do this on the page. But the trick is to make a pivot from envy to gratitude. Thank you, Karin Solee, for writing this poem. I can read it when I need it. I can teach it. But the most important pivot is the third. You move from envy to gratitude, then to thievery. What can I take from Karin Solee's toolbox into my own toolbox. I just can't write a full imitation of her. That'd be too obvious. I can't write a full imitation of Natalie Diaz. That's too obvious. You people will see it. But what can I take from their toolboxes? And for me, I have taken her tendency to use alliterative pairs and triplets, right? Well, she gleans from the Anglo-Saxon, all right? And that has been a way I've been structuring the musics in my own work, all right? I love her work, but I can't be Karin Solis. But I take a little component, a little element from a toolbox. Another pleasure, the intellectual pleasures for me is that if you know Elizabeth Bishop, you know The Fish, right? An often anthologized poem in American poetry, Western poetry, right? Karin Solis' Sturgeon is in direct conversation with Bishop's The Fish. For example, in both poems, both fish return to the water alive. Right? Bishop's fish has medals and weapons. Solis has armor, right? The Canadian poet and scholar James Pollack notes that both poems make use of biblical imagery, right? Bishop alludes at the end of The Fish to the rainbow of Genesis. Everything was rainbow, 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 right? Solis' fish at the end of the first stanza is Christ-like, a sin eater. But in the very next stanza, the fish is transformed into kind of pagan god, right? So I love that transformation, right? This is what I do continuously with every poem that I read and with my own drafts, right? Figure out what are the three pleasures, all right? How are they braided in interesting ways? Which one do I have to elevate, right? And again, this started as a reading strategy, right? And then I said to myself, well, what can you make use of this? You know, you're a practicing poet, you're a poet, then you're reading, so read like a writer, read like a poet. And so I made this strategy for reading a compositional a revision strategy, right? These three pleasures, linguistic, emotional, intellectual, right? I would encourage you to, when you read a poem or your own drafting process, try to figure them out. See, are they in balance? Maybe you need to elevate one over the other, right? I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. I love to think about those three linguistic pleasures: intellectual, emotional, you said linguistic. That's so smart and interesting. And what a great poem. Next up, we have Traci Brimhall.
Yeah, I often talk about the holy trinity of poetry in my class, and I do the heart, the mind, and the ear in like a Venn diagram, and looking for the places, like you said, where the emotion and linguistic can overlap. I think I'm just going to start with a reading of the poem and then talk a little bit about it. The poem I brought for today is called I Could Touch It by Ellen Bass. When my wife was breaking apart, my son was falling in love. She lay on the couch with a heated sack of rice on her belly, sometimes dozing, sometimes staring out the window at the olive tree as it broke into tiny white blossoms, as it swelled into bitter fruit. At first, I wanted to spare him. I wished he was still farming up north, tucking bulbs of green onions into their beds and watering the lettuce, his hands gritty, his head haloed in a straw hat. But as the months deepened, I grew selfish. I wanted him here with his new love. When I passed the open bathroom door, I wanted to see them brushing their teeth, one perched on the toilet lid, one on the side of the tub, laughing and talking through their foamy mouths, toothbrushes rattling against their teeth. Like sage gives it scent when you crush it, like stone is hard. They were happy, and I could touch it. I liked hearing both Kevin and Martha were talking about the mind in motion, and I completely agree. And I think that's a much more open way of reading, but I often read a poem as if it is burlesque, that it is the art of the slow reveal, and that there is something in this moment. I feel like in the center of the poem, the selfishness is where the poet comes out with tassels swinging. But I usually feel that that is the slow seduction we are getting in the poem, those pleasures that Eduardo talks about. We are getting an introduction to these tensions. My class all week has been talking about tension, And my class, when they looked at this poem, noted right away, when my wife was breaking apart, my son was falling in love. We begin with these sort of opposite things, this urge for eros and this moment of great suffering. Right after that, we get the wife on the couch as the olive tree breaks into tiny white blossoms that will swell into bitter black fruit. We get the opposites of black and white. And then we get this beautiful image of the sun farming up north, doing this very earthly embodied thing with his head haloed in a straw hat, something divine. He's doing the sacred work of tending to the earth. But as the months deepened, I grew selfish. I love that she pulls us in, she's making us interested, she pulls us between suffering and something divine. And then when the speaker comes out and confesses something which feels uncomfortable, maybe a little shocking, though I disagree with the speaker that it is selfish to want to be near something beautiful at a time of hurt. I don't think it is selfish to want help. But I think it's really beautiful to see not just the mind in motion, but somebody's humanity in action in this poem. I also wanted to point out to my students too, a moment of great love and intimacy, and it's brushing their teeth. How many poems are people brushing their teeth in it? And toilets in a moment of love. This toilet is not an object we associate with love. And here they are, sharing this domestic intimacy, this self-care ritual while making each other laugh and catching up on their day. And then, of course, ending with these things that you wouldn't think were about happiness, like sage gives it scent when you crush it, like stone is hard. Crushing things and hard things are not what we associate with happiness. But it was nice to, they were happy and I could touch it. I messaged Kevin also earlier in the week to say thank you for his craft talk, and I realized it was 9 years ago, I'd messaged Kevin about sentimentality from something else I'd heard him say, and we are still here talking about it. But this is the way I think you can be sentimental, that you can reveal something in a poem that might feel scary, is to make it complicated because the complicated things are true. I think it's also thinking about, to connect back to, I was trying to write down everything people were saying, but I was either writing poem lines down or I was writing notes from beautiful things you were all sharing. But the other thing about the mind in motion and Vievee reading the self into the poem as well, I was thinking about that D.W. Winnicott quote that I've often seen writers share, which is that it is a joy to be hidden, a disaster not to be found. So the thing I've been saying to my students as well this week is that it's not just show, it is also tell, it is not just sing, it is also say, and to sometimes come out from behind the curtain of your metaphor, tassel swinging or just a nice ankle twirl if that's what you want, and say the things that sometimes I am selfish, sometimes I want this thing, that it's okay to be a little bit bare in the poem. You don't have to give us everything. You can keep the fan in front if you want, but to come out from behind the metaphor of the poem and to speak and to share and to let us see each other on the page. And that's all I have to say about this Ellen Bass poem.
Thank you so much, Traci. I love it too when poems are brought up by folks who have read and taught at the festival in the past. And Ellen Bass is her latest book was just extraordinary. So it's really good. And I often in class, Jessica and I both talk about the fan dance. So I'm glad you brought up the art of burlesque. It's like, what you gonna show? Next up we have David Baker.
Hi everybody. It has been cloudy and awful here in central Ohio for about 2 months, and it looks like the sun has picked this moment to come in my window and blind me completely. I'll try to do this. This is a poem called The Sadness. The Carrier of Ladders. Page 134 in my hymnal. The sadness. Thinking of you, I lean over silent water. This head appears. The earth turns. The sky has no motion. One by one, my eyelashes free themselves and fall and meet themselves for the first time, the last time. I am a softie. I am a sap. I admit it. Sometimes on a good day, I embrace it, that I am a sucker for sentiment, for those deep emotions, love, sorrow, mournfulness, loss, joy. A Madeline Peru recording can send me over the edge. Yet in my art, making and partaking, I am allergic to somebody just standing there emoting to something. Kitsch. The triggering woe and rapture we recognize and sometimes call the sentimental. There is, I tell my students, no crying in poetry. Please, no crying in poetry. They don't recognize the illusion, and it makes me want to cry. I met William Merwin in Kansas City, Missouri in 1979 when I was 24 years old. I'd written my master's thesis, if you remember those things, about 3 of his books 2 years earlier, and meeting him was a thrill. Remaining friends until his death nearly 2 years ago was a lucky honor. The 2 poems that I've talked about this week I've chosen because they were dear friends, both Merwin and Plumlee, for many decades, and they've just left us. I further admit a soft spot for little poems, simple ones. And yet the complexity of the self-portrait in this one delights me. The powerful tug of geometry at work in this poem with its directionality, its central pivot, and the single powerful trope of the poem doing its heavy emotional lifting. It's a love poem. Like love poems, it is therefore a poem about loss, about time and time's ruinations. It is, as Anne Carson tells us about Sappho's poem, or as Catullus confirms, a love poem whose primary and ironic feeling is pain. And to make a classical point of my own, it is also a reenactment, a dramatization of the myth of Narcissus looking down into the water, seeing the apparition of his own reflection and being consumed by that self-same longing for the other. Okay, loss and sorrow. Merwin does not cry, I show my students in this poem, but look how he embodies, makes physical, a weeping-like action. This is the central trope I meant. How painful it must be to pull out one's eyebrows one by one, or to lose them this way. Is it aging, the ravages of time, the decay of dying, and to witness their being lost? Eyebrows, how close to the eyes they are, the eyes from which tears fall, in precisely the way these eyebrows fall, crying literalized and made felt. Notice the geometry, the head, the earth, the sky, looking up and looking down in reflection, the line drawn. At the center of the line, up and down, is the speaker, the pivot for his own linear construction, which is the destination of gravity. He is the hub of the orbit of his own images. By making his grief physical, Merwin's speaker makes the pain of absence or loss more physical, as though a body part were severed, lopped off, lost. The eyes. Eyes are how we take in the world, how we see. And how do we express our understanding of what we see? Oh, we say, when we comprehend that thorny math problem, I see. A last little delight. The sadness is a great example of that poetic figure, metonymy. But with this particular distinction, the physical standing in for the emotional. You'll remember metonymy is that thing when we use something to represent something related to it. Those eyebrows are in such metonymic relation, such facial proximity to those tears, that when they fall, so does his sorrow let go, detach, and fall into the gathering, moving stream of things, the stream of time, of nature, of the utterly and inutterably inevitable. Be happy to talk more in a Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. It's so good to be reminded of emotional risk in a poem. It's so, so important. Last but not least, we have Laure-Anne Bosselaar.
David, that was so beautiful. Thank you. And everybody else too. I was scribbling notes and I hope I'll remember all those invitations in side poems that you gave us. We, all of us, wouldn't be here if it weren't for Thomas Lux. Because Thomas Lux once told Miles Kuhn, who was saying to Thomas, well, now I have my MFA, now what do I do? And Tom Lux said, start a conference. And that's what Miles Kuhn did. He went, oh, okay. And it is thanks to Tom and thanks to Miles and his Mimi that we are here. And the reason why we switched, David was to be last, but the reason why we switched is because I wanted to thank Tom so that we could all thank Tom for being together here. And I'm not gonna go very deep into his poem, to Thomas Lux's poem, but what I'd like you to do is to listen to the incredible tricks and intricacies of Thomas Lux's syntax. And syntax just means how the words are ordered in a sentence, right? Family photo around Christmas tree. Dad's left arm reaches across Mom's back and even across Dottie's, his daughter, and just touches with his fingertips his son Rusty's shoulder. Dottie's 10, Rusty's 8, though small for his age, and his left eye a little lazy. The tree thick, with foils and lights, lit candles, and a mantle hung with monogrammed socks. Reindeer race across Dad's sweater. If you lift this picture to your nose, you smell cider and snow, Mom's Valley of the Lily perfume, the fire's pine knots sap. Oh, bless this family and their dog Chocolate. Bless this house and hearth. And bless Grammy, who will be here soon, though Grandpa won't this year. Not dear Auntie, not dear Aunt Elsie, dear, dear Aunt. The big blue bowl of crab meat salad she brought each year, ditto, won't be here. Bless this family, the living and the dead, and may they never send a card or newsletter to me again. It's pure Tom Lux. It's pure going from one to the other and wanting to bless things and then tripping and then noticing one thing and noticing the other as if it were for the first time, but it isn't, because that's not Tom Lux. So I just wanted to say, bless this family, bless the conference, bless us all being together around not a Christmas tree, but the celebration of poetry. Thank you.
Thank you, Laure-Anne. I'd like to open up, we have a half an hour for discussion, and we've got a couple of questions coming in, but I thought I would open with a more general question for all of you. And if you'd like to answer, you can just unmute yourselves and pop in. During, of course, the time of the pandemic, a lot of us are isolated, and reading and finding poems becomes this really essential way of staying in touch with poetry and being in conversation with it. And I was curious to hear from all of you in terms of your own process, in terms of when you sit down to write. Do you read poetry and then it catapults you over to your notebook to start to write, or is your reading time separate? Are you one of these folks that show up to a writing residency with a box of books, or you just come with your notebooks? And what works for you? What advice would you have to all of us when we sign off of Zoom today, and there we are, and maybe we have our books and the room is empty?
I'll say that in general, whenever I've written, of the years that I've been writing, I tend to imagine a reader that I love anyway. But I haven't been, I checked recently to see when was the last time I wrote, and it was with my class in fall when we did an exercise on writing joy together. And I was thinking too about the last painting I was able to make. It was because it was a gift for somebody, and how that changed when I was making something for somebody specifically that I cared about. So for me, the epistolary poem is always really productive, whether it's to an abstraction or to a person. But for me, because I'm an intimacy slut and I'm really lonely right now, addressing poems to an idea or a person and just like knowing what is on the other side is love and intimacy. That helps me personally.
Like many poets, I mean, the heart of my creative practice is attentiveness. I move through the world attentive, or paying attention. The notion of writing and revising every day for me personally sounds like hell. But I can pay attention every day, and that's what I do. And I'm always on the lookout for things that catch my eye, my ear, or any of my senses, right? Because something happens when you are attentive, right? You walk through the park and you notice the yellow throat of a bird, and you immediately think of your grandmother's stained apron, right? That spark, that leap. Something from the exterior world has aligned, has sparked with something inside the interior, right? And that's often the beginning of something, an image or a phrase or a line, right? That beautiful alignment of the outside of the inside, right? But for me, the trick is not to be satisfied with that first gift, right? Yellow throat of a bird and the stained apron on my grandmother. That's the first gift. That's the surface, right? The work of a poet is to figure out what else is in an orbit of that spark, that leap. Why did I go there emotionally, intellectually, personally, right? So this is how I kind of navigate the world as a writer, being very attentive, but also attentive to the way I pay attention and what comes to me.
Well, I'll jump in here.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, Tim. Because I don't know what I'm going to say in this. That I try hard. This is just me, not to professionalize what I do at all, and I don't know how to look at what I do as part of a process or a practice. But a strategy, not even a strategy, what I do to stay alive. part of what Eduardo was saying, that attentiveness, can feed my poems, but it also more likely it helps me simply get through the day with some attention, as Vievee was talking about too. And sometimes that turns into what I might write in a poem, and more likely what I do to survive a day without killing myself or jumping off a building or shooting a president. Sometimes I write a lot, sometimes I don't write for a long time. But the thing I do all the time is read my poems. By mine, I mean the poems that are around me, the books that are around me. Those things that provide me a more sufficient, rigorous language than all the other language that I know, that I speak, that I hear, that elevates the neurons and, in the brain so that they fire with more attention and appreciation and gratitude and caution, all those things. I got up in the middle of the night last night. I'm not sleeping very much this week. I wake up at 4 like, oh God, I got the workshop. What are we going to do? But I got up last night. I haven't written for, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks. But I had this line, and usually I lay there and think, oh, I'll remember that, right? And don't. So I got up at 3 and I wrote down a line, and wrote down another one, and I realized they came to me because of the workshop and the conversations that we're having. And if that's a process, I guess that's part of my process. I'm grateful for another line sometimes, but I'm more so grateful for the songs, the poems that people have put in the world that I can survive because of. See, that was no answer.
Yes, it was.
No, it was an answer. In fact, I was going to say more or less anything I was going to say, you said, David, and also the other people spoke. The only thing I could add is most of us who want to be poets, we became poets because there's an itch in our brain. There's some need, some hunger to speak, even if we're not even sure what we want to say or need to say. And I don't think even this isolation can stop that really. It might confuse us a little, but that's something that hasn't left me. I still have this itch in my head that makes me want to write. Now, so I don't know that I have a process as much as a mental problem.
You know
I
what
don't
I
really
do
have,
love?
oh, Laure-Anne, you want to go?
No, go ahead, Martha.
I don't have a process either, and I don't write every day. I don't revise every day. I can go for long periods of time. And I don't have, I work a 12-month, 24/7 kind of job. So I don't have times off during the year. So what I do is I take some time, sometimes away from, and that could be 2 or 3 days. It could be 2 days, it could be 1 day. And what's helped me when I'm staring at a blank page, and if nothing's coming, is to start in form. And I'm not a formalist by any means. I have to go to the book and see what the rules are and try. And I try small forms. I call them my little packets of intensity. Things have to repeat the triolet, 8 lines, 4 of them repeat. Yeah, obsession repeats for me. Repetition helps me get stuff on the page. And then I might get really into it and I might write, 10 rondelets, 10 rondeaus, 8 triolets. I might do a lot in 2 or 3 days, if only to bust all of them, if only to bust one of them. By busting, I mean bust out of. I might get 3 words and go off in another place. I also find myself coaxing myself a lot. I remember, the dog what? The dog, you don't know any dogs. The dog, you know what? The dog, you know are. The dog, you know you are. The dog, you know you are has mange. So I talk myself through a poem. I have conversations with myself a lot as I'm as I'm writing, and try to also envision if there are characters, which there often are in my poems, and often they're not announced, try to really hear them and see them, put clothes on them and hear their accents. So I'm not a person that walks through the world very attentive. Actually, people tell me that it's terrible to walk on the street with me because they're afraid that I'm going to go into the middle of the street and die, or roll, walk over somebody. I'm in my own place, I guess. I didn't know that about myself, but people have told me. So I'm not really attentive to the world, I guess. A field for me is a field. It's filled with hay or grass. I don't know the hay or the grass unless I look it up. I don't know what flowers are what flowers. I really am somebody that's driven by music, and a syllable attaches to another syllable, attaches to another syllable, attaches to another syllable, and then off and running. But Greg, if you're out there, this is brought up a lot this week, and all music doesn't a poem make. So then I look for what else is in the music and how I can ground. So that's kind of as close to I get as process, or what helps me. And generally those are things that happen for me when the page is blank, when I have nothing to work with. There is not a thing, but God damn it, I am going to write today.
Wow. I cannot write if I'm not in conversation with another poet. So I need to read and read and read, and then either agree or disagree, or most of the time I want to say, oh, you know what? Me too. Wait a minute, me too. And I'm finished with reading Bridget Kelly or Merwin or Neruda or a Flemish poet, and I immediately want to answer because I'm scared that they don't know that I hear them. And I want to tell a poet that I hear them and thus answer and say, me too, you're not alone. And that's the motivation that makes the emotional impulse connect. That's all.
I'd like to add to that. I feel, I think, very connected to what you're saying, Martha, and what was just said. I want to talk back, and I can't. One, I've been trained not to talk back in a very particular Southern way at a very particular time. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to talk back. But the way I can speak for myself and talk back to others, including a lot of my yous are my friends. God help them. So, and most of my friends are poets. So I become very obsessed with what I needed to say and didn't get to say. So that's one of my obsessions. So I go into my obsessions, and I also talk back. So I tend to walk around the day saying, okay, and then I think about it. And then 5 hours later, I have a response, and it winds up in a poem. So I almost need to be in conversation, but I'm the silent part of the conversation. Then I'm just listening, and then I respond later in a poem.
So if the powers that be are listening here, what I heard Tim say earlier might be a good t-shirt quote for next year. I don't know if I have a process as much as a mental problem. So just throwing that out there. Tim, is that okay with you? I don't know if you... Okay, so
Can I order an extra large? Thank you.
We've got a couple of questions that comes into chat. Linda Falter wrote, and she said she really appreciated hearing from international poets, and she thanks Tim and Laure-Anne for underscoring the music that can often be lost in translation. And she's hoping that we could consider post-COVID, of course, inviting an international poet to read. I think that sounds amazing. And she would love you guys to weigh in on such a possibility. Tim says thumbs up. Laure-Anne says thumbs up. There you go. There's your answer, Linda. Everybody got a thumbs up. Kimberly wrote in, and this might be more of a comment. Boy, Laure-Anne, you gave, or Martha, you gave that Clifton poem such a close reading. She mentioned something else. She said that Jaybird could possibly conjure Jay Bird as in naked as a jaybird, as in totally exposed from the inside out. And that's just like another devastating thing to think about. Elizabeth Erickson also wrote in about Lucille Clifton. She said, hearing the passion of her poems, her life, she longs for the day when we know the cruelties that mark their existence can turn into their Christmas. I have a question from someone anonymously. Could Eduardo please clarify if it's 3 words in alliteration phrase in the poem is what he loves most, or if it is 3 sections of dual alliteration?
The pattern from Anglo-Saxon verse I was talking about is 2 words in a row and 3 words in a row. 2 words in a row and then 3 words in a row. So alliterative pairs and triplets. Simple spoons, tall towers, talk, right? A way of just structuring the music, right? And sometimes I just use that in the early drafts just to get the music going and hear something. And then I revise or fine tune or jettison them at the revision process. But yeah, it's a pair of words and then a triplet of words, a trio of words.
I'm glad you caught that one. Like, that's good. Yeah. There's another question from the chat. Christopher Miller is writing in, is there an essay from Eduardo's 3 Pleasures or Traci from your Heart, Mind, Ear that might be recommended? And they appreciate that lovely framework and ideas in such a teachable format. And I guess that someone is teaching high school kids and is hoping for a good essay to share.
I mean, my ideas are kind of cobbled together from other writers, other thinkers, and I haven't written something about this, but it's a very common idea: the 3 pleasures, the Trinity, the 3 notions. Gregory Orr has the types. Yeah, it's just very kind of, we're all in an ether, kind of having the same kind of thoughts at the end of the day.
Yeah, I can't recall like reading something that then I stole that Holy Trinity from, but just I think also what I'm drawn to, like Eduardo was talking about, reading strategies then are part of your composition strategies. And so that's sort of where it came from. And also recognition that I wasn't very smart in my poems. Like I was pretty good at like the emotion. And I figured out how to do music better. And then I was like, how do I be smart? I don't know if I'm very smart. So I have a lot of facts in poems because I'm trying to trick people into thinking I'm smart. And so it's another way, just like the temperaments of like reaching into something that might balance a poem, or that might be it's a pleasure I get from poems. So trying to offer that pleasure to others. And I do use the 4 temperaments. I make the little Punnett square, and we talk through these things, and I call them superpowers in my class, and not just temperaments, but I'm like, you're so good at story or music, you have this power, you're so good at this. But we also talked about superheroes in my class, but like the thing that gives you your power is often like the planet Krypton. Superman powers, but kryptonite is what ruins him. And a lot of female superpowers are empathy in the X-Men universe, but that's also the thing that will undo them. Rogue literally unravels physically because of her overdone empathy. So thinking about like, this might be the power, and that doesn't mean that your narrative needs a ton more music, but how do you lean more in towards the thing that might balance your poem?
Here's another, can I add another suggestion for reading? I'm thinking about that tantalizing triple figure, those three things that you're talking about in the Trinity, or three things in a row. The most useful thing I've ever found to use with students and with myself about that three has to do with this ghost that haunts the love poem or any lyric utterance that I've pulled from Anne Carson, when Anne Carson is writing about Sappho in Eros the Bittersweet. Carson's talking about what we suppose as the ideal geometry in a poem as a line drawn from the speaker to the reader, or from the poet to the other, as if from a lover to the beloved. And Carson makes this great argument that that's never a sufficient geometry, and that the geometry that abides is always a triangle, described by the lover, the beloved, and this delicious phrase that she uses, that which comes between them. And working through your poem and trying to trace the outline of the ghost that comes between the ideal two can be a really profitable way to deepen your poem, or find out that haunting thing that you can't quite hear or can't quite see, that's baffling the ideal union of I and thou, or lover and beloved. A way of thinking about grounding that third thing. If you know that book, Eros the Bittersweet.
You're not going to believe this, David. We literally just yesterday went over that kind of shallowly. I didn't go deeply into it, but in class yesterday.
Cool.
So I'm sitting here, my class knows this is my self-satisfied face. Like,
see, told you.
David said it, now you believe me.
Now, when anybody else says it but the teacher, right?
That's great.
I love that so much. I'm wondering if just to maybe close, because we just have a few minutes left, if any of you briefly want to say any practices you have for getting these poems that you shared, these beloved poems, deeper into your marrow, into your blood. Things that you do to hold on to them even tighter, besides just reading them.
I write them out by hand. I'm sorry, Tim. I write them out by hand. When I read a poem that I'm bewildered by, confused, in awe of, or whatever, if a poem pauses, stills me, I write it by hand into my notebooks.
I saw that Traci does that all the time too. Traci's got a notebook where she writes her poems out.
Also, just to follow up, memorizing poems is another way to get at that as well. A lot of times, especially if you memorize and you say the poems aloud to yourself. I mean, there's something, when people talk about knowing something by heart, it's not just like a clever way of talking. I mean, there is something about knowing something in your bones and having it resident in your head and your body, you know? And so that's something that can also ingrain things there. I probably know by heart to my core, maybe 10 poems. I know some other things I've memorized, but there are a couple that I just, I can feel them in my veins, and it's a different way of understanding.
The way to embody them also for me, because this is my third language in which I'm writing, I have the file is called Personal Anthology, and I have 1,132 pages of poems that I typed, because if I look at the poems that I love and I type them, and then I have to break the line, oh, I put a comma there, oh, there's a dash there, and I learn not only why I loved them when I read them, which was the emotion, but then all the craft that was put in the poem. And my anthology now is, my computer hates it because it has to open it and then try to follow. And I think that really helps, is to help the poems go from your hand into, a book that you make of those poems.
Well, and Laure-Anne, I don't know, I can do this because we're here. Do you see this? This is your anthology.
You printed it?
Yeah, you shared it with me and I printed it out and put it in a binder. It's right here. right here. And it's like having you here with me and all of your friends here with me. Yeah, yeah. We've got a question in the chat here. This one's from Martha, a reference to Yeats. Out of arguments with others, we make rhetoric, with ourselves, poetry. And Gary K wants to know if Yeats has been an influence or inspiration for you in your poetry. You have to unmute.
Gary, I have to honestly say no, not really. I mean, I've read through Yeats, but not a poet that I return to. But I like that, what you just plucked out.
Yeah. And actually, before we go, I would love all of you in the chat maybe to name just like your house is on fire. You can only take one book with you, just one collection of poetry. I know this is a really big ass question, but just like that book that you hope everyone will read. Laure-Anne, yes, you can write 3. She's overachiever. I don't know, just for fun. And Lenny Della Rocca wrote and asked if these ideas we're speaking about also apply to prose poems and lyric essays, etc. I would say yes, but I don't know if anybody wants to weigh in on that.
Sorry, I'm grabbing my cat.
There.
Ask that question again because I was busy thinking about the book.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Vievee. Yes, I'm asking you to multitask in terrible ways. Would these ideas we've been speaking about also apply to prose poems and lyric essays?
Absolutely, to prose poems.
Yeah.
I mean, they're still poems. So, yeah.
Yeah, they are.
And I can't really speak for lyric essays.
I mean, I would think that a lot of the things we talked about might have pretty wide applications, you know, in writing, you know. I mean, the fact is we all know when we're in the presence of a poem, some prose or whatever, when it works, when it strikes us in a certain way, when it's pitch perfect, for lack of a better term. And there are any number of ways that people get there. I mean, the more you know, the more you try, the wider your, you know, your window. I mean, the better. I mean, I don't know, it's just sweat after a while.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Tim. I mean, and I studied fiction, kind of my MFA, and I used so much of what I learned. I don't think the divisions between the genres are nearly as solid as what everyone hopes. So there's some fantastic suggestions coming in the chat. We'll leave this chat up for a little while so that everyone can gather these suggestions. And thank you so much for your time and for being here. And I know that this week has really changed me. And with the inauguration at the same time, I could not be happier with things right now. And so thank you so much.